still scattered to Pentagon. They're coming after us without fire cover.
If we can draw the two base stars away from the planet.
You think you know Battlestar Galactica, the ragged fleet burning through space. Adama at the podium. Six walked through Baltar's head like she owned the real estate. You watched it and you felt it doing something to you that television wasn't supposed to be able to do, making you genuinely uncertain whether the people you were rooting for deserved to win. But the show underneath the mythology is stranger and more complicated than the version you remember.
2 more base ships just jumped into orbit. We got 4 base ships out there.
We can't hold off 4.
It was written in the wreckage of September 11th by a man who was watching the news and couldn't stop. It was visited by Pentagon officials who came not to complain, but to learn. It was held together by actors who were sometimes as lost as their characters, making decisions in the dark that turned out to be exactly right.
Reality that it created. Battlestar Galactica did the same. Matter of fact, it's really uncanny what happened.
12 facts, 1 ragged fleet. The real story of the show that changed what television drama was allowed to attempt starts right now. 12. The show began. As something nobody expected to survive, the Sci-Fi Channel did not order Battlestar Galactica as a series. What they ordered was a miniseries, 2 parts, 4 hours, a complete contained story, with no contractual obligation to continue beyond it.
It was all designed to operate against an enemy who could infiltrate and disrupt even the most basic computer systems.
Ronald D. Moore wrote it that way. He built it with a beginning, a middle, and an ending that functioned as a conclusion because there was no guarantee that anything would follow. The response when it aired in December 2003 was not what the network had calibrated for. The reviews were serious. The audience was larger than the channel's science fiction programming typically attracted. The conversations it generated were not the conversations that miniseries events usually generated. Sci-Fi greenlit a full series, and Moore went back to a story he had already finished and found a way to continue it. What that origin means is that the entire architecture of Battlestar Galactica, the serialized structure, the accumulated mythology, the 7 years of narrative weight, was built on a foundation that was never designed to carry it. The miniseries was the house. The series had everything constructed on top of it after the house was already complete. That it held together as long and as well as it did is the first remarkable thing about the show. 11. Ronald D. Moore wrote it in the wreckage of September 11th. The miniseries script was written in 2002, and it shows not as a flaw, but as a document. Moore was watching the same news cycle as everyone else in America, and he was processing it through the only tool available to him, which was a science fiction franchise that had originally been designed as a Star Wars cash-in for 1978 television.
It's a jump ahead, and then we will be expanding on the story of a lot of the characters that you saw in Season 4.
The suicide bombers, who looked exactly like the people they were killing. The civilian government, a Secretary of Education who had never expected to lead anything, suddenly thrust into a military crisis with no preparation and no roadmap. The urgent internal argument about how far a democratic society could go in its own defense before it transformed into the thing it claimed to be fighting. None of that was in the 1978 original. All of it came directly from what Moore was watching on television every morning while he was writing. The show that emerged was not an allegory in the careful, distant sense that science fiction usually deploys allegory. It was a direct conversation with a specific historical moment, wearing a spaceship as a coat. 10. Starbuck being a woman almost didn't survive the announcement when Ronald D. Moore released the casting breakdown for the new series, and the name Kara Thrace appeared where Starbuck had been. The reaction from the fan community built around the 1978 original was immediate, organized, and hostile in the specific way that devoted fan communities are hostile.
Move, come on! Over by the couch. Now!
When something they consider protected territory is being altered without their permission. Dirk Benedict, the actor who had played the original Starbuck, did not stay quiet. He wrote a public essay that circulated widely, framing the gender swap as a symptom of a cultural moment he found objectionable and a betrayal of a character he felt ownership over. The production absorbed the criticism and continued. Katie Sackhoff walked onto the set and began building a version of Starbuck that had no interest in the argument happening around her. Reckless, brilliant, self-destructive, defined by an emotional damage so specific and so honestly rendered that the question of what the character's original gender had been became genuinely difficult to care about. The performance didn't answer the critics. 9. Edward James Olmos almost walked off the show. The public image of Battlestar Galactica was one of unusual cohesion, a cast and creative team operating with shared purpose on material that everyone involved understood to be significant. The reality behind that image was more complicated, and the complications centered, at certain points in the later seasons, on Edward James Olmos.
I'm setting the terms now. Make any attempt to attack this ship or the people.
The specific nature of the disagreement between Olmos and the production's creative direction was never fully aired in any official forum, but the people who were present in those conversations have been candid enough in the years since that the seriousness of the situation is not a matter of significant dispute. Olmos reached a point where continuing required a level of faith in decisions he was not certain deserved that faith.
Genetic structure that I created comes out in Gaff, who's in 2019.
The conversations that followed were not brief, and they were not comfortable. He stayed. What that decision cost him personally, and what it produced professionally, are two things he has spoken about with the careful precision of someone who chose their words around a subject they have not finished processing. 8. The Pentagon came to the writer's room. Military and intelligence officials from agencies of the United States government traveled to the Battlestar Galactica production and sat down with the writing staff. The visit was not a complaint, and it was not a request to change anything. They came because the show was depicting questions about torture, detention without legal process, and the ethics of what democratic governments permit themselves to do in states of existential emergency, with a directness and moral seriousness that the public political conversation of 2005 and 2006 was not managing. The specific episodes that had drawn their attention were not difficult to identify. The scenes in which Colonial Fleet personnel tortured Cylon prisoners, and the scenes in which the show refused to let that torture feel justified, or necessary, or clean, had apparently entered conversations in places where those conversations were not otherwise being conducted with that quality of honesty. The writers sat with officials who were professionally occupied with the real versions of the questions the show was dramatizing and had a conversation that nobody in that room had expected to be having. 7. James Callis played a character he didn't fully understand. Gaius Baltar is one of the most genuinely complex characters that prestige television produced in the 2000s. A coward who became a collaborator, who became a prophet, who was possibly chosen by God and possibly losing his mind, and possibly both simultaneously in ways the show never fully resolved. James Callis has said, in multiple interviews across the years since the show ended, that he spent significant stretches of the production in a state of genuine uncertainty about what the character's ultimate meaning was supposed to be. Not performed uncertainty, not the uncertainty of an actor navigating an ambiguous script, actual uncertainty about what he was building and where it was going and what it was for. He made a decision early that the uncertainty itself was the material. Baltar's fundamental condition, never knowing whether he was damned or chosen, whether the voice in his head was divine or pathological, whether his survival instinct was cowardice or a form of grace, was something to inhabit rather than resolve. He played the not knowing. 5. The final 5. Twist wasn't in the original plan. The end of Season 3 of Battlestar Galactica delivered one of the most discussed revelations in the show's run. The moment when 4 of the series' central characters discovered, simultaneously and without preparation, that they were Cylons. Tig, Tyrol, Anders, Tori. People the audience had spent 3 years understanding as human, as the humans, as the moral baseline against which the show's questions about identity and personhood were being measured. Ronald D. Moore has been direct in interviews about the origin of this decision. It was not in the original design. It was a creative choice made in the room, driven by the momentum of where the season was going, rather than by a long-term structural plan that had been waiting for its moment. The implications of what it meant for those characters, for the mythology, for the final season that would have to absorb and resolve it, were not fully mapped when the episode aired. The writers had made a promise to the audience without yet knowing exactly how they were going to keep it. 4. The writer's room. broke down in the final season. The conditions under which Season 4 of Battlestar Galactica was produced were not the conditions under which the preceding seasons had been produced, and the difference is visible in what aired. The show was ending. The expectations that had accumulated over 4 years of critical acclaim and devoted audience investment were enormous, and specific people had theories, commitments, emotional debts they expected the finale to honor. The creative disagreements inside the room about how to resolve the mythology, what the Cylons ultimately were, what the ending meant, what the show had been saying for 7 years and needed to finish, saying those disagreements were real, and they were documented and they were not fully resolved before production began. What emerged from those conditions was a final season that contained some of the most powerful individual episodes the show had produced, and a structural resolution that the most devoted portion of the audience received, with a mixture of genuine emotion and genuine frustration. Both responses were reasonable. 3. The show changed minds. Inside the military. The claim sounds like the kind of thing that gets said about important art without anyone being able to substantiate it. In this case, it can be substantiated. There is documented on-record evidence that Battlestar Galactica's portrayal of torture, specifically the sequences depicting what the Colonial Fleet's personnel were willing to do to Cylon prisoners, and the show's consistent refusal to frame those actions as justified or necessary or cost-free, entered real conversations happening inside military and intelligence communities about the ethics of enhanced interrogation during a period when those conversations were among the most consequential happening anywhere in the American government. People who were professionally occupied with those questions watched the show and found that it had articulated something that the policy arguments and the legal frameworks and the political speeches had not articulated. The Pentagon visit to the writer's room was one expression of that. The individual accounts from military and intelligence personnel about how specific episodes affected how they thought about specific practices are another. 2. Moore knew the ending from the beginning. Not everything was planned. The final 5 were not planned. The specific shape of the 4th season was not planned. The accumulated mythology that the show constructed across 7 years contained significant portions that were built in the room in real time, driven by creative momentum and actor performance and the particular directions that story chooses to go when it is being made by people paying close attention to what it wants to become. But the ending was Moore's from very early. The decision to bring the fleet to a primitive Earth, to have them choose to abandon the technology that had defined and nearly destroyed them, to scatter across a planet that the audience would eventually recognize as their own prehistory. That destination was held in place across all the seasons of improvisation and revision that surrounded it. The final image, Gaius Baltar, walking through a modern city while a news broadcast discusses the emergence of robotics technology, was something Moore had been protecting for years, kept in reserve against the pressure to change course that the final season's production difficulties generated. He kept it. It aired. 1. BSG changed what television was allowed to attempt. Before Battlestar Galactica, science fiction was a category that serious television criticism engaged with as a genre phenomenon rather than as dramatic literature. After it, that position became very difficult to defend in public without sounding like someone who hadn't watched the show. What Moore and his writers demonstrated across 4 seasons was not that science fiction could be respectable or that it could handle serious themes with appropriate gravity. It was that the genre's specific tools, its capacity for displacement and allegory, and the examination of human questions through non-human frameworks allowed it to go places that straight drama couldn't follow. The questions about torture and democracy and identity and what a civilization owes to the things it creates that Battlestar Galactica was asking directly and without apology were questions that prestige cable drama of the same period was largely approaching from an angle or not approaching at all. The show didn't just elevate the genre, it demonstrated that elevation was the wrong framework, that science fiction at its best wasn't reaching up toward drama, but doing something drama couldn't do on its own. Everything that came after, every science fiction property that received serious critical treatment, every genre show that got discussed in terms previously reserved for prestige cable, all of it sits in the space that Battlestar Galactica opened and refused to close behind it. Adama didn't promise it would be easy. He promised it would be worth it. 4 seasons, 1 ragged fleet, and a show that changed what television was willing to ask of its audience. If this hits you somewhere, the show has already reached subscribe. So, say we all.